In the last 6 months, we focused on two major stories as a nation: protests over police brutality and the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. But according to the Columbia Journalism Review, those stories are not distinct. Instead, they're a web of, quote, intricate and vast connections. For more on this, let's bring in one of the writers of that article, Alexandria Neason. She's a staff writer at the Columbia Journalism Review. Alexandria, thanks so much for being here. You write that journalists have decided coronavirus and the killing of George Floyd are not two distinct stories. Explain to our viewers why you see the past 6 months of life and death in America as being interconnected.
The U.S. can only be understood by the ways that its inequities interact with each other. So if you want to understand a story of police brutality, if you want to understand the story of George Floyd's murder, then you have to also understand what has happened up until this point. And so at the beginning of this year, as the coronavirus spread across the globe and as it arrived in the United States, Black people and Black journalists understood that it would exacerbate all of our existing disparities, to include health disparities, to include economic disparities. And so the story of George Floyd is that he was murdered by a white police officer. He was also infected by the coronavirus prior to his death. And he had also lost his job due to the economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. And so all of these things interact with each other, and you can't understand one story without understanding the others.
Alexandria, I love this article because I thought to myself, this is sort of a conversation that we've been having in our own house about how quickly, and quickly is a relative term, things bubbled up and over. And, you know, my husband and I have talked about the fact that, you know, if people had not been at home because of the coronavirus, so they didn't have to go to work, would they be able to become, you know, activists so instantly? If they hadn't been in their houses for 2.5 months or known people who had died or become sick because of the coronavirus, would they have been as frustrated as they became? So I think it's great to look at how things crisscross. Then the other thing that you bring up is the impact of the media, how we cover these stories, how the media has traditionally covered stories about inequality, police brutality, and versus what's happening now. You talk about, for generations, police, at least when it came to mainstream media, police had the benefit of the doubt, and marginalized groups saw these major media outlets as institutions of white supremacy. But now we also have this whole other thing happening, right? It's social media. It's that people don't necessarily have to get their information from designated outlets. And that's also having an impact on the way the story is being received.
Yeah, I think historically, the American press has aligned itself with people in positions of power over marginalized communities. And in an American context, that means that the press has aligned itself with white supremacy. You see examples of this all throughout history, everything from newspapers in the Jim Crow South that reported on the lynchings of Black people like they were street fairs. You saw this very prominently in the reporting from news outlets on the murder of Emmett Till. On up until modernly, where we see things like the framing of stories, the language that we use, the way that we reach for words like looting and rioters to describe the actions of Black people that we hesitate to use in other situations. And so one of the things that's changed is in the digital age, of course, is that social media has offered people another avenue through which to receive evidence of the news. And so normally journalists act as gatekeepers, essentially. We make choices in how we tell stories. And there are other options now where somebody can set up a live stream and watch the same protests that reporters are at. And so what you're seeing is sort of alternatives, and it allows for comparison. And I think that the criticisms that are being lodged at press are stronger now because of those alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that you write about are the differences in media coverage for cases like Ahmaud Arbery's, which had video footage depicting his death, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor's, where there was no video. I think it's really interesting and it's fascinating, and I wonder if there's some historical antecedents because of this. You know, until you saw video footage of black people getting hosed by police and having dogs sicked on them during the civil rights movement. There were print reporters who were covering this, but it didn't have the visceral image that allowed the entire country to see what was happening down south. I wonder if it's the same, for example, with Ahmaud Arbery or with George Floyd, that so many people just see what Black people have been saying for many years happens all the time, and people don't see that. And even if they read in the newspaper, there's a disconnect. What's your analysis there?
I think that the parallel that I see actually is about who we put at the forefront of our stories. And Black women have always been put on the back burner in this way. And so when you think about which stories of police brutality go viral, when you think about what stories get told in the national press, and which stories we pursue most aggressively, they tend to focus on male victims of police brutality. And this reflects a historic tendency to exclude Black women, to include Black trans women. And I think that the question of when we run with a story has to do with, to whom are these videos newsworthy? We're making a choice to try and convince people of something. And of course, Black people have never needed to see videos to be convinced of a problem. And what we do in the press is we decide to prioritize the attempt to convince white and other people that something is happening and that something is pervasive over the trauma, the trauma and re-traumatization of Black people. And so we make that choice every time we run a story and run the video with it. And we see those priorities reflected in which stories get the most attention. And so Breonna Taylor, there was no video. And so her story still, even now, after people have said out loud, we're not paying enough attention to this story, you still see her sort of deprioritized in terms of column space and airtime.
Can we talk about the way the media has covered the White House through this whole thing? And it's sort of, Vlad can attest to this, it's kind of like a no-win situation. There are people who accuse us of going too light on the administration, normalizing some of the president's bad behavior, and then others that say, well, you're just haters, that's what it is. The mainstream media, it never liked Donald Trump, and so you're always attacking him. How has the coverage of the White House changed? You say it sort of changed in June.
Yeah, I think, I actually think the shift that we saw in June had to do with an escalation. So certainly for the last several years, there have been real and serious and concerning attacks from the highest rungs of government and threats to press freedoms. What we saw in June was an escalation to physical violence. And certainly some reporters have always been put in positions where their physical safety is threatened. But now in covering the demonstrations and protests that began after George Floyd was killed, you started to see sort of widespread evidence of the same violence that was being the same violence that the general public was being impacted by happen on camera to reporters. And I think that it's sort of reflective of what we've done in the last couple of years, which is to center ourselves in these stories. We have a much easier time calling a spade when the attack is on us. And so we sort of do this gymnastics, this language gymnastics when we're describing police violence, the violent response from police to these protests and demonstrations. And when it was us, when it was our folks who were being beat up, shot with rubber bullets while they were out just trying to do their jobs. I think that that's sort of how I conceive of the shift, is that it was happening to us. We had an easier time calling an attack, and then you started to see language choices in like headlines, for example, in describing the broad violence that we were seeing protesters be met with at these largely peaceful demonstrations.
Wow. Alexandria Neason, you and your colleague Betsy Moret wrote an incredible piece for the Columbia Journalism Review. I urge everybody to check it out. It's called "The Story Has Gotten Away From Us." It's on the Columbia Journalism Review site right now. We could continue having this conversation for another 30 minutes because it is so illuminating and I think so crucial for people to get an understanding of what we've been living through over the last 6 months. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you so much for having me.